So now that we've gone and painstakingly modeled out our low poly here, let's go ahead and start cutting into it. Now, I'm not talking about the model necessarily. I'm more so referring to cutting in UV seams. So if you're not familiar with UVs or seams, or even how to create a 2D texture that's displayed on a 3D model, the long and short of it is that we need to provide the software a way to understand how we would cut up this 3D model and place it within a 2D image or a 2D plane. One way we can think about this is with clothing. If we think about the life cycle of clothing, right? When it's initially created, what we do is we start to create some of those patterns, right? Like for the lapel and for the shirt, as well as for our sleeves and such. And at the end of the day, once we've gone and mapped those out, taken the fabric, we then start to stitch that together at the seam line. So hopefully this lingo is starting to make a little bit more sense. And we create something 3D out of that. Now, what we're doing here with 3D is kind of the inverse, where we've gone and created the shirt first in the 3D model, and then we have to take it and present the software with how we would effectively cut it up and display it on this 2D plane. So a little bit confusing. Hopefully that's, cleared some things up rather than added more confusion. But truthfully, I wouldn't blame you if that just kind of muddied the waters a little bit more. But as we work through it, hopefully it's going to become a little bit more clear. So I first want to start with my rubber low, and I want to give it a material. So I'm going to select it and create a new material, which I'm going to call tire. I then, under the base color category, want to just hit this little dot, go down to image texture, and let's create a new generated image. So I'll select that. We can call this grid. I'm just going to click and drag down on both of these and type in 2048 so that we have a 2K texture to work with. We're not going to need an alpha channel for this. It's just for viewing purposes. And this is the most important part. We want to make sure that this is set to color grid, and we can hit OK. So now if I head on over to the UV editing, we can see that we're getting that color grid showing up. It's not looking great, but at least it's showing up. And if I select everything on this model here, we can see this is the color grid. And we've already got a free unwrap with our model here because we chose a plane and then model around that. But this is looking nothing like what we're going to want it to be. So I'm just going to make sure that I also change my viewport shading to be matte cap. And if your texture isn't showing up on your model just by default in your 3D seam, go ahead and set this to texture as well. And that should show the texture that we have in our preview here. So what's actually going on here, right? Well, we've created this 3D model. It's a very simple 3D model that we're using modifiers to generate the rest of the geometry. So we only have limited real geometry, which is this model down in the center, to actually generate real UVs. So that's why we're going to have this really crazy, trippy, repeating pattern. And this just simply isn't going to work. So at this stage in our development of the tire, we're going to have to start applying some of our modifiers so that we can actually work on this generated geometry. So I'll go into our modifiers here, and I'm going to apply our mirror, our lattice, the array, and our curve. And you know what? Actually, I'll just go ahead and apply all of those since I'm pretty confident with this piece here. Now, you might want to make sure you just go and save a backup. And actually, what I will do is Control Z all of that to make sure I go and do exactly that. So let's go and Shift D to duplicate this. And we can call this rubber BCKP, which I use as backup. And we can even create a new collection within the low poly, which is going to be our low poly BKCP. And then I just go and uncheck that so it's hidden. So we have that backup just in case things kind of go south here. So now we can go and start to apply all these modifiers. And if I go into edit mode now, you can see that we're getting all of this geometry as something we can start to use in our UVs. So a rule of thumb, a pretty good rule of thumb, is when you have sharp edges in your model, which we can see is denoted by these teal regions, those are areas you're probably going to want to add a seam to. Because these are denoting areas of transition, it's going to provide a little bit of a better bake if we go and start to mark these as seams. So I can go ahead and just select this one here and hit Shift G. And I want to select similar sharpness. So that's just going to select every edge that's marked as sharp. And now if I come up to edge, mark seam, now that's going to turn red. Now we're still going to have these edges as sharp. It's not like overridden the sharpness or anything. And if we come up to our 3D view here, you can see that I can turn the seams off and we still have that sharpness. It's just a viewport priority. We can't have it as blue and red at the same time, right? Otherwise it would create some intermittent color between those two. And chances are you're going to want to see where your seams are more times than you're going to really care about looking at the sharpness. But just rest assured your sharp lines are still there. So now with those seamed off, let's go and select everything and hit U to unwrap and unwrap this. And so that's looking a lot better actually. We can see that there's some actually useful UVs here and it's starting to look a lot better. But I want to unwrap this a little bit of a different way because you can see we're going to get a lot of loops here or a lot of circles, and that can cause some issues with packing your UVs. These become a bit of an obstacle when trying to pack things together because they're just such a difficult shape to make fit correctly. And they also create these holes, which sometimes is really just wasted space. Now that isn't to say that we never want to have these donuts or these circles in the UVs. Sometimes it's very useful and sometimes that is exactly the way we want to unwrap things. But I'll pose another potential possibility to you. And then let me just go ahead and find the correct face. So we can see here that on the side of this tire, right, we have this text running. And we have it running kind of, as we would expect in a vertical and horizontal way. But when we're working with tires and we're thinking about how real tires are developed, a lot of times we'll notice that the text actually runs along the curvature of the tire. And so how we would have to do that in our texturing space is actually create text that wraps around the UVs over here. So that's going to be pretty confusing and honestly way more work than I personally am ready to take on. So I can't expect that of you as well. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to continue to cut up these UV seams. So I'm going to select this line here. And I'm also going to select this line here. And again, to do this shortest path selection, I just have my edge selected there and I'm holding Control and then selecting to select every edge in between. So again, let's go back to edge, mark seam. So now we have two seams there. So if I select it all and hit U to unwrap, now we're going to have these two shells, which is a good start, but again, it's still trying to round everything out. So bear with me for a second and let's just go and repeat this process on the other side of the tire. So we'll select those and I'll select these here. And I've also got mark seam as one of my favorites. And to mark favorites, you just come to the operator and right click, and then you'll be able to assign it to quick favorites. Now I've already got it on quick favorites, so it just show me to remove it. And the quick favorites key is the Q key. So I'll go and mark seam and I can go and unwrap. So what I want to do now is I'm going to select one of these shells. I'm also going to come up to our header here into our guides, and I'm going to turn the display stretch on. And this is going to turn everything blue, but I just find it's a lot easier to see my UV shells in my UV space as well. So what I want to do is I want to straighten out this UV shell here. And Blender provides a tool that's actually kind of hidden and I don't think very well known that's going to allow us to do this. So if I go and select one of the faces on this model here and I hit the W key, now again, you're probably going to be able to right click if you're a left click select user. And we're going to have this follow active quads button. So the description is maybe a little bit cryptic if you don't really understand the lingo. It says follow UVs from active quads along continuous face loops. But really all that means is it's going to take the active quads orientation and it's going to essentially flatten out the rest of our UV shell based on that orientation. So if I go and select this, you can see we kind of got it flattened out, right? But it's doing a lot of this weird stretching and pinching. And if we take a look in our 3D view, right, it's kind of distorted everything. So we need to give it a better face to unwrap to. So I'll come down here to one of these faces. And again, it doesn't matter which face you really select. I try and find a face that's already kind of close to being a square. So I'll take this one here and I'll right click again. And I'm just going to auto align, and it's going to align both of those verts to the closest axis. Now, sometimes this doesn't always work and we'll have to go and just align either on the X or the Y, but it should work, 9 times out of 10. So I'm going to select these verts and hitting Shift R to repeat the last process. We should now have a 90-degree polygon. It may not be exactly a square, and that's okay. We just want to make sure that it is all 90-degree corners. And if I go back into face select, again, face select is up here, and I'm just hitting the hotkeys 1, 2, and 3 to swap between those two. If I select this now and hit W to follow active quads, now we can see that's given us a nice straight shell. And we can take a look here and see that it's also got the text now running along the curvature of our tire here. So I can go and rotate this to make sure that the text is, up and down on this tire. And hopefully we can kind of see now what's going to happen once we get to texturing, right? I'm going to be able to, write my text just horizontally like this in my texturing, and it's going to show up along the horizontal, curvature, I should say, not the horizontal axis, the curvature of our tire relatively easily. So in this particular instance, this UV setup is going to save you a lot of headache. So let's go ahead and repeat this process one more time together before I let you off into the world. And I just want to make sure I can find the right shell. Here we go. So coming into our UV shell, let's go and find one of the, kind of areas that are closest to a square. And actually, you know what? I'll do this one over here instead. So let's align auto, and I'll make sure to just select each one to make sure it's all straightened out. I'll go back into face select mode and select this one here, and hitting W and follow active quads. Now we're going to have that straightened out. And then I'll just come back in here, rotate it to make sure that it's facing the right orientation. And that's going to be pretty good for right now. So go ahead, do the other side of the tire on your own, and we'll be back in a sec. Perfect. So hopefully you've got those all flattened out in your UV space. You'll notice that, one or a couple of your UV shells might be a little bit of a different orientation than the rest of them, and that's okay. That's something we're going to tackle in the next lesson. But for now, just make sure that they're laid out flat, kind of in this rectangular fashion, and we're going to be good to go. Now you'll see that we also still have this circle here. And if we take a look, it's kind of producing very weird results, right? And if we look at the geometry of this, it's one continuous circle all the way around the top here. So how would you go about actually flattening this out, right? If it's one continuous strip, where do you actually, bend it and turn it? It really becomes a matter of physics to kind of understand how you do that. And really the truth is there's no nice clean way to unwrap it the way we have it currently without actually creating a seam line. So again, we're going to have to go and cut in some seams, and I'll do the top and the bottom again because I want to make sure that we provide each space with enough resolution. Well, you know what? Actually, let's do a little bit of an experiment. So let me go and mark this as a seam, and I'm just going to select one face in here and hit L with my mouse cursor to select only the faces within this seam group. And let's go and unwrap it again. So we're going to get one continuous strip, and it's going to look a lot better. Now it's unwrapped it kind of, angular, so it's going to look a little odd. But if I go and unwrap it this way here or straighten it out, right, it's going to look pretty nice. However, the problem is because it's such a long continuous strip, it's not going to fit nicely within our UV space. So we'll have to go and scale it down. But then we're going to run into the issue where, okay, well, we've got the texel resolution, and it's going to be lower than what we have on the sides of our tire. It's going to be a texel mismatch is what that's usually referred to as. So what that means is that we can potentially have much crisper texture detail on the side of our tire, but because of the size of this UV shell, in order to fit in our 0 to 1 UV space, it's going to have to take up less of that UV space, ultimately meaning it's going to get less pixel quality. So what we would want to do is, like we did with these tires, actually break it up into 2 different spots so that we can really maximize that texture resolution. So I'll go and mark that as a seam, so that now if I select both of these and I hit Control L to select that entire, both of these seam groups, and I go and unwrap that, now you can see we're going to start to maximize some of that. We've effectively split that long rectangle in half, and so we don't have to worry about really sacrificing that texture detail. And you can actually see right now, it's actually getting, better texture resolution than the sides. But again, that's for next lesson. And fortunately for us, it's all going to be laid out as rectangles anyways. But for whatever reason, if yours isn't, just go ahead and repeat the same process we did for the sides, and you're going to get the same exact results. So now that we have that all seamed up, let's go ahead and select our hub, and let's go and add our tire material to that asset. So it's going to be kind of a pinkish color. Yours might be a different color, but a solid color nonetheless. And if we go and select everything, that's because we have all of the UVs converged into one spot by default, because we haven't unwrapped this yet. So how would we go about unwrapping this, right? Well, like I did with the tread, I'm going to start at some of the areas we've already defined as seamable areas, I'll say. Right? These are going to be the areas we've marked as sharp. It's generally a good idea to mark your sharp edges as seams. So making sure I'm in edge mode, not face mode, I'll go and select, well, actually, we don't have to go and select them all manually like I've shown. We can just select that, hit Shift G to select similar, and we can just select sharpness. And I'm just going to do a quick look over to make sure we've got all of them. And yeah, these are all areas I'm going to want to mark as seams. So going to our edge select or favorites, if we've added that to our mark quick favorites, let's go and mark seam. So now if I hit U to unwrap, we're going to get a little bit of chaos, but some areas are going to unwrap actually very perfectly. We can see this area right here is pretty good. I don't mind the outer area here, but again, we're going to take a look at maybe cleaning that up a little bit. And same thing for the other side. Now, the areas that are going to be, pretty tragic right now are going to be these inner rings here. And again, we can think of these like we did for the top of the tread of the tire, where it's one continuous loop that you really can't nicely lay flat without cutting in seams. So these are the areas I'm going to tackle first. And again, if we just look at the UVs for these, yeah, that looks like an absolute UV nightmare. So we're going to try and mitigate that as best as we can. So I'm going to go and select and make sure I just select all of the edges here. Just one continuous line. So we can mark that as a seam. And now if I select this, and I make sure to hit L to select all of it, I can go ahead and unwrap that. And we can see because of the general shape of it, it's actually going to unwrap pretty cleanly. So I'm not going to have to do any more work on that. So let's just quickly repeat this process for each one of these holes here. And now for this one here, I'm not exactly sure if it's going to be required, but I'm going to go and split this up into two as well, just to make sure that we're going to be able to maximize the texture resolution. All right, so now that we've got those all seamed off, let's go ahead and unwrap again. And we can see, there we go. We're getting much cleaner UVs for all of these. And it's just gonna honestly work pretty much out of the gate for us because of the, rectangular shape and nature of these areas. So really, I don't want to do too many more alterations to this. The only area that I do want to actually take a look at is going to be these outer rings again. Like I had said before, circles are not bad all the time, but if I can go ahead and break these large circles up into smaller, more rectangular UV shells, that's probably going to bode much better for our texture process and baking than if I was to just leave it as these. And again, if I want to write maybe some text or have some type of effect that's scraping along the direction and the curvature of this hub, it's going to be a lot easier to do when we have a nice flat and rectangular UV shell. So like we had done with the tires, let's go ahead and find a nice seam all the way up to the top. And I'm going to split this in half again. So I'll find another seam down along the bottom, mark that seam, repeat this process on the other side. And I just want to make sure I'm kind of lining this up appropriately here. So I've got the top, bottom, and then select that bottom all the way up to there. And okay, we should be good to go now. If I go and unwrap this, there we go. And we're going to get the very familiar kind of like half moon crescent shells, but we know now how to go and actually tackle those. And just a quick refresher for us in case we've forgotten in the last, 5-10 minutes, we're going to want to make sure that we 90-degree all of these corners, select one of our faces, and follow active quads. And that's going to get us exactly what we're going to need to continue as we unwrap this. So go ahead, finish these other crescents on your own as well, and then we'll move over to quickly unwrapping the air cap. All right, so hopefully your UV seams look something kind of similar to mine. Now, if they don't, you might have your own reasons for that, and that's all right. This is all just part of a learning process, and so we're going to figure it out as we go. Now let's go and finally unwrap our air cap. And it's going to be very tiny. So if we go and select this guy and then add the tire material to it, this one's going to be very simple now that we've kind of unwrapped the, I would say, two larger and harder assets of this model. And again, the areas that I'm going to want to start with our UVing is going to be our sharp edges. So I'm going to select this one here and mark that as a seam. I think I'm going to retroactively actually go back on this sharp edge there. And I'm going to go and clear that, not clear that seam. I would like to clear that sharp so that this is going to be one continuous face. I think we're going to be able to kind of bake away that smoothness there. So I don't think it's going to cause us too much of an issue. So, and then I'll go down here, mark that as a seam. I'm also going to mark that as a seam as well. So if we go and quickly unwrap this, right, we're going to get some nice kind of UV shells here. And we're also going to get some not so nice UV shells here. So what's going on, right? Well, again, kind of hearkening back to that initial tire tread that we had an issue with trying to kind of unwrap, it's going to be the nature of the continuous face loops. So we can see with this one here, right? This is really it's a tube. We don't really have anything that's going to be nice about kind of flattening it out unless we go ahead and create a seam. So I'm going to do something kind of on this back side here. Again, if we take a look, we're going to be viewing this air cap from over here. So we're really never going to be seeing this seam. And if we can hide as many seams as possible, that's going to be the most ideal scenario. And I'm going to repeat that process for this one down here. So now if we go ahead and unwrap it, we're going to get some very, very nice and clean UV topology. And that's going to look really cool. So now if we come back to our layout and I go and select our texture, we're going to have a bunch of different texture resolutions, but this is starting to look like a very, very clean unwrap. And it's giving us a very good base to understand how we can actually better unwrap this in the next lesson. So stay tuned because that's what we're jumping into right now.